Hi, everyone, and welcome to this session of UCalgary's webinar series. I'm Deborah Yedlin, and I'll be your moderator. If you've participated in one of our previous webinars, welcome back. And to all our new viewers, thanks for joining us. We're coming together today to share knowledge from our UCalgary experts with the community as we continue to navigate the COVID-19 epidemic. ADHD can be difficult to cope with during the best of times. Never mind when we're sheltering in place. Joining us today are Dr. Karen MacMillan and Dr. Michael Zwiers to talk about coping with ADHD in adults and children during the coronavirus pandemic. We'll hear about homeschooling, staying focused, managing distractions, and setting boundaries for daily life while working from home. Our speakers will start us off with a presentation and then answer questions from the audience. If you have a question during the webinar, please use the Q&A feature on the bottom of your screen, and we'll get to as many of your questions as we can. This webinar will be available on demand, and we will email you a link once it's online. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge that we're recording this webinar on the traditional territories of the people of the Treaty 7 region in southern Alberta, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy comprising the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai First Nations, as well as the Tsuut'ina First Nation and the Stoney Nakoda, including the Chiniki, Bearspaw, and Wesley First Nations. The City of Calgary is also home to Métis Nation of Alberta, Region 3. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dr. Karen MacMillan holds a PhD in counseling psychology, and she's been a registered psychologist in Alberta since 2003. She's an executive co-director at Foothills Academy and an adjunct clinical assistant professor in the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary. She's actively involved in advocating for individuals with learning disabilities and ADHD in her work on several boards and committees. Dr. Michael Lee Zwiers is an adjunct assistant professor in the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary. He completed graduate degrees in educational psychology and counseling psychology, after which he pursued 2 years of postdoctoral training in clinical psychology. He specializes in the assessment and treatment of attention disorders and learning disabilities, anxiety, mood, and autism spectrum disorders across the lifespan. Michael currently works in private practice at Lighthouse Psychology Services and has developed an adult ADHD intervention group called More Than Just Lists. Please welcome Dr. Michael Zwiers and Karen MacMillan, who will begin their presentation. Over to you, Karen.
Hi, thank you very much, Deborah. We are pleased to speak on this topic today. I think it's a very relevant issue and something that I think both Michael and I can really connect to the last couple of months as well. If you're tuning in today, obviously you're very familiar with the struggles of and challenges of dealing with ADHD. And obviously the impact that COVID-19 has had on all of us is adding another layer of difficulty. So it's exciting to talk about it today, but we also wanted to start off by just pointing out that we're not just aiming for surviving, we're aiming for thriving here as well. We're going to try to cover a lot of territory, so I just want to make it clear that we are going to try to talk about all three presentations of ADHD, the inattentive type that used to be called ADD, the hyperactive impulsive presentation, as well as the combined that has symptoms of both of those. As well, we know that we have about 7% of kids who have the diagnosis of ADHD approximately, and approximately about 2/3 of adults still meet the criteria when they're older. So this is a topic that we're going to try to address today and make some of our examples and discussion relevant to both adults with ADHD and kids. So COVID-19 has been a confusing, surprising, and challenging time for all of us, and nothing that we have really necessarily prepared for, but there are some features of ADHD that make this a particularly challenging experience. ADHD is related to our ability to self-regulate, and when we have that loss of structure, the added stressors that can impact our executive function and our thinking, the increased distractions of working from home, or the loss of boundaries so that we get stuck into something for a long period of time, the overwhelming amount of new information, the existing high rates of overlapping anxiety disorders with ADHD, and also that potential for a lot more conflict in homes when we have all the stress of this situation, but also a lot of unexpected togetherness. And that can be parent-child conflict, but also adults within a home. And it's important to remember too that in any household with a child with ADHD, 1/3 of those parents are probably going to also be having a struggle as well. So we have many households with parents and children with ADHD. And then we also have an added layer of the technology that we're all reliant on right now, which can be a bit of a time suck for kids and adults with ADHD. So we need to recognize that that balance, we sort of lost it if we'd had it already. And if we didn't have it already, we have more challenges. So as I said, ADHD can be generally sort of conceptualized as an ability to regulate. From a cognitive perspective, people with ADHD are interest magnets. So we're pulled in, sucked into anything that is particularly rewarding to our brain or exciting or interesting. And that's why you can see a child with ADHD sit and play video games for hours, because that is highly stimulating to them. And it's difficult to move their attention away from it or stay focused on something that's not highly rewarding. So it's not an ability to be attentive, it's the difficulty to regulate where the attention is going. And emotion is something that we don't always talk about with ADHD, but it is another piece. That regulation piece is there as well, and something that a feature of ADHD, that emotional regulation, is something that's probably more prominent in many homes right now with the unexpected events. And behavioral regulation is important as well, that ability to meet a goal that you set out to do. You want to go follow through with something, but are you able to follow through with that goal-directed behavior? And so one of the things that we know about when we're talking about ADHD presentation is that individuals with ADHD are consistently inconsistent. It might be something you've heard before. And that just means we can seem to be able to do something one day, and then a few days later that specific task or performance ability is not the same. And that can be really frustrating for families who struggle to figure out what is purposeful here and what's not purposeful here. So I'm going to talk about the three sort of areas I outlined there, called the cognitive, emotional, behavioral self-regulation for a minute. So in terms of the cognitive, providing some general structure and consistency in a day is really important. What time am I expected to be sitting down on my desk or at the kitchen table to do schoolwork, right? But also, paradoxically, we also have this value in having some novelty and flexibility in our day to moderate depending on how well we're able to cope in that moment or how challenging the activity is. We need to be able to take mini breaks, and Mike will talk a little bit more about that. We also can take advantage of some external cues. In my house, about 15 minutes before we start school today, or in any day, I put on some quiet music in the background just as a cue that we're starting to hear, this is sort of something that's about to time to shift. It's sort of this quiet music that sort of stays on during school time, and it's a way to make that shift. Also making time visible, so it's a countdown clock or something like that. There's actually a lot of self-monitoring devices and things that we can use on our smartphones. There's some apps such as The Forest, which grows a tree while you're not surfing the net, and then as soon as you start to surf, the tree dies. and so it can be a great thing. You can set the time for how long you want, and it's a great tool for us to be able to regulate ourselves or just notice how long we're able to do that. There's also visual countdown apps or timers on our phones where we can try to encourage ourselves to either begin or to get through a certain amount of a task, or even to stop doing tasks if it's really stimulating to us and we're going on for hours and hours. For example, an adult working from home that's really getting into something that they love and looks up and all of a sudden it's 11 o'clock at night. That's where just simple things like setting smartphone alarms can help us have some more balance right now. All right, so talking about the emotional regulation, we want to make sure that we plan for this ahead of time, because when we're emotionally dysregulated, we're not really in a great place to make those decisions about what we need to do to get ourselves regulated again. So when we're talking about kids or adults, we want to make sure that we sort of have a plan, of a toolkit. What can I do when I start to get upset? Where can I go? And those wheres are pretty limited right now, but a walk around the block, or going to a different room to read, or jumping jacks in the basement, or whatever we need to do, we need to be able to get a sense of what are my options, what options are valid options that my child can have. I don't necessarily want them running out the door or driving away in a car, but I do want them to be able to do this, this, and this. And so that we have an understanding of what are great ideas and what are approved ideas before we get upset. And the other thing to remember is that we all are nicer to each other when we feel good about ourselves. And so making sure that we have those islands of competence, or getting recognition for something in a way that we're contributing to the family or being helpful to others every day is really valuable. So if we're involving someone in an ability to help make dinner or do something for us, they start to feel good about themselves, even if it's not necessarily the task that we wanted them to do, and that sometimes can really to generalize to other things that they're working on. Making plans to manage our own stress is huge. Because ADHD is a disorder of dysregulation, as a parent, it's incredibly important for us to make even more of an effort to stay regulated, because emotional contagion is real and a big struggle in many homes. And so if one or more people in the home are already very dysregulated, if we succumb to that as well, then it's going to be much harder for everybody to get their brains back on track again. So you know, none of us are superheroes, and we all have our challenges, but recognizing that our dysregulation only increases the amount of dysregulation in our home. And on that note, timeouts are work for anyone of any age. When we're looking at behavioral self-regulation, I think it's important to recognize some of those basic behavioral principles around getting some immediate feedback and just building in rewards in our day that give us an opportunity to recognize that we've accomplished something, but then also are sort of that carrot that we're holding out too, to make sure that we, you know, if I get this done by 10 o'clock, then I get to have half an hour, you know, on the trampoline or playing a game with my sister or something like that. We want to make sure that we have those little things built in, because otherwise, if we're not chunking work or time throughout the day, that's going to make it a really insurmountable task. And also, we don't have, then when we're looking for some kind of consequence, we're making it up rather than having a natural consequence because we didn't need a time to be able to, or weren't able to fit in a task that we wanted to do. And again, I think Michael's going to tap on that a little bit more. One of the nice ways to pull in an entire family, especially if rather than singling out a child, around healthy habits, which are incredibly valuable to all of us in terms of our emotional, behavioral, and cognitive self-regulation, is making sure that we're getting enough sleep. I'm sure you've heard lots of experts speaking about that. Eating, exercise, those things that really do help us stay regulated, instead of just having it be something that we're trying to change in one or two people, making sure that we have a discussion about how everybody can improve and everybody in the family pick a goal that we can be working on. And that really helps to get some buy-in in the family. One of the things that I think are important to think about, especially with our young people, is the difference between a knowledge deficit and a performance deficit. Again, if you go back to that idea that individuals with ADHD are consistently inconsistent, it can get very difficult to understand when somebody's just not capable of a task very well at this time versus they're choosing not to. And we definitely, in terms of people's ability to feel good about themselves and increase their sense of efficacy in the world, to not be ascribing a choice or intent to something that is just at that point in time an ability issue. So it's important for us to understand the difference between a knowledge deficit and a performance deficit. And so sometimes as adults, as parents, we default to lectures. You know, if I tell you for the 85th time about why this was bad or why this is dangerous, then maybe you'll finally understand. Where oftentimes kids understand what the reason is for it, and they understand, they could probably even tell you exactly what they should be doing, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they have the ability or skill set to do it at all, or maybe just at that time. So the performance piece is actually much more valuable for us as adults, rather than spending that effort on the lectures and the warnings, is to spend that time on really coaching in the moment, scaffolding, doing things with people. And even as older teens start to challenge our ability to give them advice, or even kids, our advice around, you know, that would be really helpful if you did this, or this is a great tool to use, or why don't you set the time? That's, you know, many of us aren't quite open to hearing that from others. So this is a great time, actually. There's an opportunity with us being at home so much with our children to be able to be co-investigators a little bit. And so, okay, let's try it your way tomorrow, and then we'll try it my way on Friday, and then we will see which was helpful and which wasn't helpful for you. Does that really work for you? Okay, if you give me a chance to try this, and then we'll come back and we'll talk about it, and we'll see which of those methods actually work for you. So that understanding can evolve, but approaching it from a co-investigator standpoint can be really valuable in getting buy-in and those kinds of things, and just be curious together about what does and does not work. ADHD is a very diverse disorder. There's, as we looked at, there's 3 presentations of it, but there are, that combined with personality and severity of symptoms means it's a very diverse group of people, and no one thing works for everyone. We need to be curious and experiment. I just want to do a quick note about medication. That's a choice, and if it's something though that you or your child will already have, I think the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, are the demands right now more, same, or less than they were prior to COVID? Some of us were thinking, okay, so my kid's not going to school anymore, I don't need to give them their meds. But a case could be made in many households that the demands actually right now, the cognitive, emotional, behavioral regulation demands right now are higher than ever, in dealing with the stress, in trying to be motivated without the structure, and being able to get through, you know, navigating relationships all day long without getting much time away from each other. So we need to think about that, and whether or not, if the demands are as same or higher than usual, then maybe I don't need to be taking a medication break right now. And I think particularly as we start to look at getting back out into the world and things opening up slowly, impulsive children and a 2-meter physical distancing requirement are not a great fit. And so that's something to maybe even consider as well, in terms of whether or not they should be taking their medication right now, if they have been prescribed medication. And my final slide before I pass things on to Michael is really around just that sense of calm and peace within the family. We do want to make sure that we're choosing our battles. What is our ultimate goal? Is our ultimate goal to have happy, productive children, or is our ultimate goal to make sure that they meet a deadline right now for school or whatever it is? We want to make sure that we are prioritizing the things that are most important to us, and not finding ourselves fighting over every basket of laundry or everything of dishes. We want to make sure that we are having a lot of time to connect. And again, Michael will pick that up a little bit more in a minute. The planning together, I think, is particularly important for older children and teens. And again, as we go back out into the world, we're navigating a lot more ambiguity. What is safe? What isn't safe? Does my teen understand well enough to go back into the world and act in a responsible, safe way with all these restrictions right now? And it's almost easier when we were all stuck inside. So one of the things that we can think about for older kids and teens is asking them to maybe make a proposal to you about what is appropriate or safe for them to be doing right now. You know, you want to see your friend, okay, well, look at these restrictions on the government website and let me know what you think. What would be a good way, safe way for you to meet your friend? How would you go about that? And just put some of that back onto them, so that it's, rather than you speaking to them or giving them that advice, that it's a decision you're making together, and encouraging their understanding of the actual issue so that they can help come up with the solutions. Avoiding power struggles, sometimes humor, distraction, and just delaying conversations until people are cooler and calmer is a really valuable thing. Noticing the difference between intent and ability, as I mentioned. Tagging behavior is an interesting one, because it really is saying sometimes as parents we are really frustrated, and we make a consequence that we can't really follow through with. And we say, well, then you're never going to get X again. And then that is something that we immediately, 20 minutes later, go, why did I say that? Now I have to follow through with that. Or that we don't, even worse, we don't follow through with it, and we end up, you know, undermining our own authority. So it's something that is basically just the basic idea of saying, you know what, that wasn't acceptable. There's going to be a consequence later, and we'll have a conversation in a few minutes. I think we both need some time apart, so that you're not impulsively saying something that's unhelpful. And then that last one there, I'll just leave you on, is maybe even my most important point, which is just that idea of a relationship bank that we have with each other. And the fact that inherent to ADHD is that we're giving a lot of feedback. Kids that struggle to, you know, come to the front door with 2 pairs of, you know, 2 socks, or the thing that they've been asked 3 times to get, or whatever it might be, it's very easy for us to get into that mode of critical feedback. Even if we're trying to make it as constructive as possible, we're giving a lot of corrections. And really, ultimately, in order to have that be successful, we want to make sure that we're depositing into that relationship bank for every one of those withdrawals that we're making. And ideally, it's sort of a 3 to 5 positives for every withdrawal of constructive feedback we're giving. So in order to keep the relationship good, to make them continue to feel good about themselves, for them to realize you see the difference between your child and their behavior, we want to make sure that we're spending or giving deposits into that account through spending time together, playing games, praising their effort even if it doesn't have the outcome that you or they wanted, and making sure that they feel good about teaching you something or sharing their passions and interests. So just thinking about that relationship bank, I think, can be really helpful for all of us.
Great. Thank you very much, Taryn, for starting us off. I'm going to move us through the next section, and I know we have questions already coming in. So we're looking forward to getting to those questions and responding to as many as we can today. I'm going to focus on just some key areas that we need to keep in our minds as we're working through this process of surviving and changing and transforming surviving into thriving. So that's why I wanted to talk about priorities. And I'm not talking about priorities for getting things done. I'm talking about priorities for thriving. And so the first thing here is prioritizing relationships. The people you're living with, you're going to keep living with them and be together long after COVID-19, I hope. So it's really important to put an emphasis on everybody enjoying the ride through this. The second thing is to help us through this, if there's more than one adult in the house, take turns doing supervision. A third key priority is to manage motivation. Whatever it is you're working on, when you're dealing with ADHD, it's about motivation management. We're trying to move the window of success right closer so that we can be successful. People with ADHD have a lot of great intentions. We have trouble on the follow through. And I say we because I have ADHD myself, so I understand it from the inside out. So you have to manipulate and manage your own motivation. And the last really important one is maintain a sense of humor. Try not to get too caught up in taking the health aspects seriously. They are serious, but we don't want it to become so intense that we have a miserable life with our families. So, for example, turn hand washing, masks, social distancing, cleanliness routines into games. It can be, let's play the surgeon game. We'll put on a mask. Let's play the social distancing game. If anybody other than a family member gets closer than a hockey stick distance from you, you have to move away from them or run away from them. Schedules. So I'm going to talk about two sides, the scheduling, but also not being too locked into it. So the idea is you want to plan a framework for success. Plan your schedule the night before, so when you get up, you can put on that music Karen talked about, and then get going on what you're going to be doing. You don't have to think about it too much or organize things at that point. Schedule things that are challenging when you're more energized. That's going to be different for every individual, so you need to kind of manage that for yourselves. And then switch between high appeal and low appeal activities. That'll keep everybody motivated and going. Next slide. Thank you. Scheduling the workday. So make sure you have these important breaks that we can all look forward to, the meals, the snack breaks. Kids at school are looking forward to recess time. I was a teacher, I know about this. Try to go a minute over after that recess bell goes, you're going to have chaos in your hands. These kids know that they've earned that break, and so they deserve it. So put it in the schedule, and then you can count down toward it as you're doing your work. Schedule those movement breaks. We know that physical exercise and activity in general helps to temporarily reduce and manage the symptoms of ADHD. We have some really good research on this. So I have some short ideas of quick activities that you can do, anything that's going to get a burst of energy. And also schedule quiet times. This is for practice. We all need to know how to do this. I taught kindergarten, and even the very youngest of children can learn how to just relax and listen to calming music. Some of this may have to be go into your own space, find your own space, and have some calm time there. As much as we like to be together, we also need time alone. Next one is rewards. There are a few slides related to rewards. Rewards is the idea of something to look forward to, the carrot that we're working towards. So plan these rewards and plan celebrations. After you've accomplished something that's meaningful or hard, you need to celebrate it, not just reward it. So we talk about fist rewards, the idea of making them frequent, immediate, as close to having done the successful action, small, so you can do them repeatedly, and tangible, something you can kind of taste, touch, look at. And keep them novel and rewarding, motivating to be rewarding. So all of us with ADHD, we're novelty seekers, and we get bored really quickly with the old things. Oh yeah, I started that Netflix series and I didn't finish it because I lost interest. So you find another series, find something else. We need to find rewards that are unique to each individual, and we change them up regularly. Types of rewards, things to say. You tell them, I'm proud of what you did, but teach them also to say, I did a good job. I did my best. Things to do, activity rewards include social, this is social aspect. And these can be small, 10 minutes of fun reading with mom, 10 minutes of playing a game with somebody else, bouncing the ball back and forth. And of course, things to get, that's the kind of reward we're familiar with. Next is getting back to this idea of routines. You have the routine provides this framework, but if you have too much structure, particularly for the ADHD person, it can feel like constraining. So that can also create frustration if you're trying to keep everybody on target and on task for these frames of work. So think of it as a kind of an outline, and we're going to fill in the spaces. As long as the work gets it done, it doesn't matter so much the order. And expect variability. Some days you have a great day, you're able to do a lot, and other days it's just one of those wing nut days where you got to just go with the flow and say we're not going to accomplish a lot. We're all like that. So allow children to choose which subject to work on during the work period. Kind of a choosing board. You can put them all up there and say, go pick the one you want to do next. Plan unscheduled mini breaks. Like you're obviously, this is driving you crazy. It's too much work. It's time to get up and move around. Let's do some dancing. Write some fun activities on slips of paper and have them draw them out at random. Time for a random activity draw. Next is adults working from home. So just a few quick tips. Identify a predictable workspace and tools and separate them from the rest of your life. Otherwise, it will invade your life. Some employers think that COVID means we know where you are and you can work 24/7. You need to separate out personal life from work life. So plan those work hours, stick to them. And when you're doing tasks, try to group them. Don't try to multitask. It doesn't work. If you're going to plan to do your emails, do it in the morning, end of your day, maybe 3 times a day, but don't try to do it at piecemeal. If you're going to be doing writing activities, try to lump them all together. We just know we're more effective doing it that way. Accomplishing tasks. Here's one of the most powerful tools that you will have in your toolbox. So plan a time frame to do a task. You have the child there or yourself and you say, we're going to do this activity. I need to do it for half an hour. Person says, that feels like too much. It's way too much. I can't do it. It's impossible. The ADHD brain says, what else can I do in the moment? There's kind of this internal resistance that says, don't want to do that. And even if you're an adult, it's kind of this pouty little bit. Or there's another part that it feels like, oh, I'm not ready. That feels too overwhelming. It's too much. So what you do is you say, I'm not going to do 30 minutes worth. I'm not going to do a half day's worth. I'm just going to do 15 minutes worth. Still feels like too much? I'm going to try 10 minutes. Still feels like too much? Let's do 5 minutes. And what you want to do is just get started, just to get you going. Once you're going, most people are able to continue going. And if you did bargain with the kids, they get 5 minutes, then at the 5-minute point, you might say, well, 5 minutes is up, but you want to try to keep going if we can. And then if you kind of get a window that works for you, then use that same window the next time. Schedule that amount in the near future. On weekends, plan for special activities. You really have to separate weekends from the weekday. Plan for meals, games, special outings that you only do on the weekends, something to look forward to for everybody. Plan for family time, fun time, and chores time may be part of that. A suggestion that came to me from a parent, plan for an electronics-free day. This is really important for several reasons. It gives you an opportunity to focus on the people in your life and the real world around you, not to get distracted by this thing. The people who make these devices are really successful at getting us addicted to them. And you will find out very quickly, how much you are addicted to it by trying to avoid it for a single day. If you can't do it, that tells you how much you're hooked into it. Homework and teaching. I was a teacher. A really effective teacher does not spend every moment of the whole day doing schoolwork with kids. So get these frameworks of expectations. So if it's an elementary school child, you're going to do 2 hours in a day. Break that down into chunks. It might be 4 30-minute chunks. It might be 6 20-minute chunks, or 8 15-minute chunks. And then you work your way through them. That way it feels manageable. Don't get this idea you're going to be sitting the kids down and working for hours on end on schoolwork. Next, emotions. Karen talked a little bit about emotion regulation. I'm going to give you 4 quick steps to deal with intense emotions. Identify triggers. What is triggering these emotions? Is it transitions? Is it getting, putting down that electronics? Is it chores? Is it homework? Whatever it is. Is it the siblings? Figure out the trigger. Get the child a rate. How upset are you right now? How angry are you right now? How sad are you right now? Give you a number on a scale of 1 to 10 or 1 to 4. Next thing is, if it's too intense, you need to get away and take a break. When our brain is flooded, our body and brain are flooded with stress hormones, our frontal lobe, the part that helps us to plan, to think, and work our way through problems, goes offline. It's like screensaver mode. And you cannot think. Sometimes you get so intensely emotional, you cannot even talk. That is not the time to try to have a conversation with someone. You need to help them calm down and get back into their frontal lobe. Get active. That kind of emotional stress gives you tons of energy and you want to use it up. So teach the kids to run around the outside of the house, get out that door, run around the house 3 times, come back in, we'll have a conversation. Dance to music, whatever it is. Electronic addictions. Okay, so we all have this, but I just want to give you a simple framework for dealing with this. To reduce the addictive potential of these things, we need to schedule them. You have a time limited and scheduled and predictable times. You're going to say between 4 and 5 o'clock before supper, that's electronics time. Sit down with them if possible and engage in the electronics with them. Whether you're side by side or you're playing a game together, then you can help them transition out. It won't be them saying, oh, but I'm just in the middle of, because you'll be with them and you'll say, I know we're in the middle of this, but our time's up. So we're going to have to let this go. We'll pick it up tomorrow, right? So you're teaching them and modeling how to let go of these things. The whole thing about addictions, casinos know this. The intermittent, sort of unexpected reward, that's what keeps you coming back for more. So you need to take the unexpectedness out of it and make it predictable. Lock it in and don't stray from that. You're less likely to have problems with this. Okay, the last slide is back to Karen.
So we've thrown some principles as well as some really specific strategies to you. And as I said earlier, no 2 families dealing with ADHD or individuals are in the same circumstance. So we just want to encourage you to take some time over the next few days to think about your own circumstances and what is working right now. Because no doubt there are some systems or times in your day or week that are working well, but then what is, conversely, what's not? What are the worst parts of your day that you could almost predict are going to be those challenging points? And then looking at some of these principles and strategies in terms of how you could begin to implement them in those times. Looking at exactly, ideally what you want your routines to look like, but then also thinking about it from realistically the developmental age of your child, not just that chronological age, but these ADHD is a neurodevelopmental disorder. So we know that our expectations need to be customized to what is appropriate for them. So looking at sort of what is reasonable and in an ideal world, and then what are the priorities? We don't need to change everything at once. What are we going to prioritize and trying to shift right now for our family?
Okay, thank you very much for your presentation. And of course, there are quite a number of questions that have come through. I'm just going to start with one though, just about the general distractibility. I mean, most of us are distractible to some degree or another. And so what do you see as the dividing line between general distraction, that's normal, so to speak, which everybody has, versus having ADHD, and that sort of how do you look at it for children versus adults? So for example, there's a question about, if you've got a young child who's in elementary school, generally disorganized, is that a warning sign? How concerned should you be about that versus somebody, is there merit to someone who's in their 40s, 50s, or 60s pursuing an ADHD diagnosis? So tell us what we should look for youngsters and for people who are older. What's generally accepted distraction versus something that needs to be more deliberately addressed?
I'll take this one. It's the answer is not so simple. We as clinicians, when we're trying to frame a diagnosis, just like going to your family doctor with a sore throat, you need to determine the cause, what's driving that particular symptom, the sore throat in that case, or distraction in this case. So one thing I would do is try to put them in an environment without distractions. There's nothing around to distract them, visual or auditory, and then see if they can focus, or you can focus in that environment. If you still find yourself distracted, then that distraction is coming internally. Now, some people still have trouble dealing with outside kind of movement, activity, or sound. So in those cases, we might try to give them a kind of a cubicle, work cubicle with little walls, and see if that helps. Earplugs for some people, they need it. But the whole issue of diagnosis, unfortunately, is a little more complex, and then that often requires consulting with your family physician or a specialist.
I guess the question is, are there certain signs that you should look for as a parent or within yourself to say, you know what, I think this is bigger than just being disorganized. There's other stuff going on.
Yeah, can you get stuff done?
Okay, so it's even if you have a list, can you get stuff done? Is that it?
Yeah, if you're not getting things finished consistently, there's probably an issue going on. The other thing about ADHD is there's this variability. So if it's something you're really interested in, you can get that done. If it's low motivation, the average person can say, I'll suck it up. I can do this for half an hour, for 45 minutes, whatever it is. But ADHD brain, a lot harder. You have to really start manipulating that motivation.
Okay. So question about teenagers, how to manage teenagers when they're going through puberty that have been diagnosed with ADHD. I mean, there are hormones that they have to deal with. Does that change? Does that manifestation change from the time, let's say, if they are diagnosed while they're in elementary school versus as they go through puberty?
Yeah, certainly the hyperactivity symptoms tend to decrease a little bit as we age. But as I said earlier, about 2/3 of adults still meet the criteria. So the symptoms, for the most part, don't go away, but honestly, the risks sometimes increase because we're expecting teens to be more independent and take more things on in the world. So we need to recognize that they have to really we have to continue to scaffold expectations for them so that what they're taking on is not overwhelming. So just because they're not standing to eat dinner anymore doesn't mean that they're not at risk still. There's a lot of things that are happening for teens, such as exposure to substance use or driving, that are very much higher risk concerns for ADHD kids. We need to continue being very, very cautious about and making sure that we engage them as much as possible in understanding and managing their ADHD. And that can be really challenging. Oftentimes kids say, oh, that doesn't bother me anymore, or, it's not an issue for me, but we need to really help increase a bit of self-awareness and self-monitoring so that they do have some buy-in for some supports.
How do you help them in the context? I mean, they tend to engage in risk-taking behaviors. So as teens, that's something that concerns parents. Is there a way to better manage that risk, those risky tendencies?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we have our ADHD symptoms under control, both in terms of potentially medication or sort of behavioral and environmental structures, and then we also have a really high understanding of what ADHD even is and how it's not just, unfortunately, lots of people think that ADHD is something that just impacts them at school, and they don't have a good sense of, this impacts many aspects of our lives, relationships and home, etc. So having a good understanding of what it could look like and those impacts, I think, is really important. But then as we move into teenage years, even though the risks change and maybe even the supports change a little bit, recognizing they're equally necessary, even if the hyperactivity piece is sort of falling off.
Yeah, one thing I would add to this whole idea, and it is complicated in dealing with those all teenagers, right? This lack of foresight and just into the things, and the peer pressure and making decisions. So developing their sense of self, so they have the confidence to say to somebody else, "I don't want to go along with this," so they don't kind of get roped into things.
Right.
And then another thing with teens is balancing out rights, what everybody gets: shelter, clothing, food. Privileges, right? Not everybody gets those. You have to earn those by showing responsibility. So rights and privileges balanced by responsibility. And keep the relationship respectful, and really, you need to be open to listening to them and understanding them, and really getting them. When they know that you're on their side, then they're more likely to be open to having a conversation with you about risks and about decisions and things like that.
So from a schooling perspective, considering, a lot of the schooling is being done through electronics and parents are trying to work from home, how do you have a good shot at managing the device time? I mean, the kids require the computer to do their work, but they may go off and play video games as soon as the parents sort of focus on what they need to do. So how do you manage that? Do you have any suggestions for managing that?
Yeah, that's something certainly we're experiencing in our house. Yeah, I think one of the keys for me is making sure that we together come up with some ideas about what the goals are for the day. So I actually find that's more helpful, like Michael said, in the evening before, rather than in the morning when you're just, getting going. But identify sort of what are the key targets for the day, and how are you going to go about it, and when can I check in with you, and when do you expect to be done this part? And if you're going to take a break, how long are you going to take it? Are you going to set yourself an alarm? Are you just setting those expectations up ahead of time, so that rather than deciding for them what's going to happen or not happen, ideal situation, they're going to say, no, I'm going to try to get this done today. But if you see me taking a break, it's going to be because I'll do this, or I'll take this, set this alarm if it's going to be checking or calling a friend or something, so I'm not on too long, so that we are able to give them that increased ability to self-monitor, because we want them to practice that. We need them to practice that. We need them to have some self-awareness and practice those things. But we also need to be able to have a sense of what is reasonable and not reasonable to expect from them in a day. And ultimately, that conversation ahead of time is what's going to help us monitor that.
What about parents who've been using electronics as a reward for completing work? So on the one hand, you need it to do your schoolwork, then you're using it as a reward for to complete work, kind of messes up this whole notion of a schedule. And I guess, where does that lead you as a parent and that whole electronics challenge?
It's something we're facing as a society. Surveys of university students are actually research on looking at how they're spending their time when they're using electronics. High school students, university students, 60% of their time is off task, doing other things, social media, etc. 60%. That's out of every hour, 25% is on task. Sorry, 25 minutes out of every hour is on task. So we're all struggling with this. It's affecting everybody. We all need to get a grip on it. So it's basically segregating that time, setting goals for yourself, as Karen talked about. And then if they're having trouble switching or managing it, you might need to switch off those particular programs at that time. But at the same time, you need some flexibility, because they need to connect with their friends. If they're doing that through social media, they need that opportunity. You don't want to become a militant in your own household.
Especially now.
Especially.
So there's a question: for an adult recently assessed and diagnosed with ADHD, what might be some effective ways to bring up this subject with a boss, especially under these COVID work from home situations that we're facing? I mean, not everybody believes in it, understands it, and as I think Karen said, 66% are could have ADHD tendencies. So how do you deal with that yourself, and then translate that into how you work within your workplace, even though it's an altered state right now?
There's actually a government document produced by the Alberta government that is for employers. It's actually ADHD in post-secondary is one of them, and another is ADHD in the workplace. It looks at guidance for it. Basically, ADHD is considered a disability. It comes under human rights legislation, and so accommodations are required. Reasonable accommodations that aren't excessive for the employer, which most can accommodate. Smaller the company is, the harder it might be to get kind of major accommodations, like your own office or something like that. But yeah, it's kind of knowing your coworkers, knowing yourself, and really knowing what you need when you go in for the ask. Say, this is what I'm dealing with. This is what I'm looking for. Can you help me with this?
But if you are recently diagnosed, do you really know what you need?
Yeah, that's the problem. There are resources as well on the Center for ADHD Awareness Canada, specific to adults too, and helping you just sort of identify what it is that you need. And you know, it does take some practice, it takes some education to really understand. But as Michael said, it's a lot easier whether it's a teacher or an employer, if you're able to go and self-advocate with some ideas of, you know, I'm going to try this. Even if you're really newly diagnosed, maybe it's going to be, I'm not sure if this is going to work, but I'm going to give this a try, and I'll come back and let you know what is or what isn't working for me. This is what I would, this is the reason I'm trying it, and I'm hopeful that it will be helpful, and I'll be able to meet this next deadline. And I'd like to talk to you about it afterwards and let you know if it was helpful or not.
What about sleep strategies? You have situations where kids who are on medication, they tend to sleep a little later now because the structure is different, and they stay up a little bit later. It's also, you know, I think students generally, as you're older students, that you need some sleep strategies. Can you talk about what you'd recommend for kids with and adults with ADHD in terms of managing sleep and in a time when the structure is a little different than it has been?
Yeah, I can share with you a handout, just like the other one. I'll see if I can get a hold of that, and we can have it available. So a handout on sleep. Basically, the core of it is what we call sleep hygiene. It's the routines that you integrate together in combination, changing the lighting, changing the music, changing the activities, kind of dialing everything down at least an hour and a half before bedtime to send the signal we're getting ready for bed. Keeping it as close to the same time as possible every night. And it's perfectly fine if that bedtime is shifted for the whole house, you know, ahead by an hour, hour and a half, or whatever that number is, as long as they're getting enough sleep. There's one, so again, those actual, whatever those routines are that become sleep associated for you, you know, find them and use them. They're going to be different for everybody. Some people need to have their pajamas on. Some people need to have a certain kind of drink or a snack. Some people need to have a shower. Other people, that wakes them up. Yeah. You know, kind of work out what works for you. And then a few sort of biological things. Stay away from stimulants. Caffeine will stay in your body for 6 to 8 hours after you've taken it. So you want to look at that timeline when you're having things with high levels of caffeine, like coffee. Tea and colas have less, but they still can have some in. And then there are things that can help, you can consume that can help you relax. So warm milk releases tryptophan, that helps to trigger this relaxation response. Another one, just looking biologically, is melatonin. Our body, by being exposed to bright lights, stimulates through the eyes the production and storage of melatonin. And that's this substance that, as the sun goes down and it starts getting darker and that sort of nighttime, it gets released, and it makes us, you know, gives you that warm kind of droopy-eyed feeling, and people start yawning. That's melatonin at work. Now, when you're looking at screens of any kind, bright lights, it stops that from happening. It actually keeps on the production and storage of it rather than release of it. So that's where we need to reduce exposure to screens. 1.5 to 2 hours before bedtime, we shouldn't be exposing ourselves to screens. So if you have somebody who needs to be looking at screens, UVEX Skyper glasses are the only ones. I've seen 3 research studies that have done research on them that block almost all of the blue wave light that comes off of LEDs and off of these screens. I know some of you may say, well, I can watch TV and fall asleep, so that's not true in my case. You're falling asleep because you're exhausted. And I can tell you, it not only impacts the sleep onset, it delays it, so everybody's getting less sleep on the whole. It used to be 8 hours sleep for all adults. Now it's somewhere between 6 and 7 on average because of lights, I think. But it affects the quality of your sleep. So the circadian rhythm cycles that we go through, that restorative sleep, that is all affected, and we spend less time in restorative sleep so we don't wake up feeling as rested. So do yourself a favor and get rid of the screens an hour and a half to 2 hours before bed. And
what about this teenager that keeps on staying up late and sleeping in? Do you just say that's it? You wake them up at the same time every day, no matter how late they've been up?
Yeah, it's just a matter of what's tolerable and reasonable for everybody in the family. How many hours ahead? Is it 1 hour, 2 hours, 3 hours? You know, midnight seems to be a pretty dark line.
Yeah.
They're going to bed after that.
Yeah, teen circadian rhythms are just do shift forward, right? And so this is actually a time where we can sort of work with that a little bit, as Michael said, but we still need to get the total amount of hours. And there is some sense that, electronics are a right to have in my room all night or whatever it might be. But I do strongly recommend that we move away from that. There should be, ideally, as Mike said, time well before bedtime that we're off of them. And because it can be such a power struggle for so many kids and teens anyways, if that's just the expectation every night, then you're taking that power struggle away from bedtime as well.
Right.
And one other thing I would add is just, I think we're all maybe getting a little less exercise than usual right now too, especially kids who have a lot of extracurricular activities, et cetera. So that is something to consider too in terms of overall ability to sleep right now, is making sure that we are getting enough exercise.
You mentioned, Dr. MacMillan, the term scaffolding as a strategy for parents to help with kids. This person who's listening in says they're not familiar with scaffolding. Can you speak more to this and how to implement it?
Sure, yeah, it's that area between doing something for someone and having them do it completely independent. So it's all those phases in between that where maybe they start to watch you do it, and then you let them do part of that task, and then they do the task with some coaching from you, and then they do the task with just some occasional reminders from you, and then they're doing it on their own but letting you know that it's happened, and then eventually they're pretty independent in it. And so that whole scale of activity can take a short period of time or a long period of time depending on the task, but it's sort of our recognizing that our goal is, as parents, to try to remove ourselves from the situation as much as possible. And that's why teenage years is such a great opportunity to try to let them self-monitor and let them increase their self-awareness to see if things, experiment with what does or doesn't work. We'd rather them doing that in our house now than when they're older. So, being able to have that scaffolding where we support a skill, but then we really try to remove ourselves out of the situation. And failure is a great learning tool.
Yeah.
We don't, that's not something to be scared of. It's the way we all learn.
Yeah. True. Question about ADHD brain chemistry and wiring that doesn't go away, but there are comorbidities often associated with ADHD, like anxiety and depression, learning differences. Can those go away at all? Or how do you support? So can they go away? What supports are important? Can they go away with medication? They go away with therapy as you get older? And are there any tips you might have for people who perhaps have one of the comorbidities of ADHD and depression?
Yeah, I look at this as a different, when I'm doing treatment, I look at this differently than I do with somebody who comes in with solely depression or solely an anxiety condition.
Okay.
You look at the conditions and think about them. ADHD is considered a lifetime neurodevelopmental disorder. It can have different kinds of impact or impairments over the lifespan. But if you think about it kind of being continuous, whereas something like depression tends to be episodic. So you'll have an episode of depression, it'll come and then it'll go away. Something like anxiety disorders, the average length of those is quite long, or longer than 8 years if it's untreated. So that's looking more like a lifetime condition, but of course it can be treated. So I think about the ADHD as more closely linked to who we are. These other conditions are something we acquire. And when you have ADHD, you're more likely to get some of these other conditions, whether it's anxiety, depression, addictions, whole range of things. Learning disabilities are more common in ADHD. I think of them for the most part as secondary conditions. So they're acquired, and you want to look at why they're acquired. Some of the pathways to depression are a sense of failure. You're not reaching your potential, feeling like you're letting people down, feeling like you're letting yourself down, feeling like there's something wrong. Getting called out, getting into trouble, that can start to make you hard on yourself, and you can develop depression. Anxiety can come about as a natural response to all those same kind of triggers. You've got the environment saying, you messed up again, and then you're just waiting for the next, the shoe to drop. Or the kids in the playground saying, that's not how we said we were going to play the game. We made this rule, and you forgot it because you didn't listen to it and you missed it. So you start to become anxious. Or you can start to feel overwhelmed because the tasks that you have before you would just seem like too much. So again, anxiety is acquired. So go back to the starting point. What's causing these? The ADHD. Treat it, manage it, or get yourself organized around it. And I've seen a lot of people where it improves. I had one adult I worked with. She was 30 years old. She came in and said she had been seeing psychiatrists and psychologists for 10 years, treating anxiety and depression. The last psychiatrist, her third psychiatrist, diagnosed ADHD. She said within 3 hours of taking this medication, she said my anxiety and depression were gone. And she said I could make Outlook tasks work for me. So that's just, I mean, that's a kind of a potent story, but it's a reminder of how that works for us. They're interconnected.
Right. And go ahead, Karen, you were going to say.
No, I was just absolutely going to agree. I think sometimes people get treated or diagnosed with anxiety and are struggling with that for a long period of time. And then their kids get diagnosed with ADHD and the light bulb comes on and we're like, oh, wait a second, maybe this is part of what's been a struggle for me this whole time. And even if we have the diagnosis, if we're not treating it well, if we're not doing everything that we need to do to manage it, we're still struggling with the symptoms. There's a lot of comorbidity, and anxiety is one of the biggest, but there's a lot of things that can appear, and they're all not separate things. They are all related back. And I would absolutely agree with Michael is the ADHD piece is a good place to start to deal with it. Mm-hmm.
And I guess what's important to understand too is it's not a young person's issue. It manifests throughout your lifetime, and it's never too late to address it. Is that fair to say?
Yes, that's fair to say. And the other thing about age is people with ADHD, if they acquire anxiety and depression, they tend to acquire them at younger ages than people who don't have ADHD. So sometimes those early onset anxiety and depression disorders are indicative of an underlying ADHD.
Interesting. There's a question from a university student just wondering about, if they're living on their own, they have to make that their own structure. Now they're dealing with, online course delivery. What's reasonable for them in terms of managing the courses and the schoolwork in a different kind of environment where they may not be able to access support from their social infrastructure, and sort of maintaining their attention so they can continue to study. Are there any tips for university students in this current environment who are faced with studying online, and the intensity of course is different than it is, let's say, in elementary or junior high school or high school?
I think there's some ways that we can create our own structure, because absolutely that is something that they're missing. So whether that's calling someone, a friend or a family member, and saying, I'm going to get this done by this time, and I'm going to call you later and let you know that I've done it, and have some of that, or using some of the apps or other opportunities where you're setting a goal for yourself today. This is the minimum I'm going to get done, and this is what I hope to get done. And then honestly, it sounds a little corny, but keeping some kind of success log so that you can track what strategies are working for you and what aren't, so you can build that self-awareness and self-monitoring, rather than just going into bed and going, yeah, that was a bad day, or oh, something must have worked today. But to really try to narrow it down. What was it that you moved location for every task and you were working in different areas? Was it that you had a visual checklist and you felt good about checking it off, or you called somebody, or is it just that you really needed the pressure and you're closer to the deadline, you worked better, which many of us experience?
Yeah.
And then in which case you need to start setting up a lot of mini steps and chunking your activity so that you can make sure that you have a lot of little deadlines. One of our biggest enemies is always going to be, for anybody, but especially with ADHD, is trying to eat the elephant all at once, rather than one bite at a time. Right. So make sure that we break that down into dates and small times. That gets done for us in elementary school and junior high. Right. And as we go higher in school, we need to start doing that ourselves. And it's a skill that sometimes is like Michael said earlier, saying to myself, I'm just going to do this for 5 minutes. I'm going to do it for 5 minutes and get started and see what happens. Sometimes, especially if it ends up being more rewarding or exciting than you think, long time can go by before you check again.
Yeah. Just a couple of things to add to that. So first of all, get a study buddy, somebody can work with you. Karen talked about setting a goal with somebody and then checking in later. If you work with a classmate who is really well organized, they can help you do that organization, planning, and getting things going for yourself. Second thing is, if you're at a post-secondary institution, they will have an accessibility services center. They have an obligation to provide accommodations and supports to you. Get yourself registered there if you're not already. Ask for accommodations and supports. Tell them about your struggles. Don't be afraid to ask professors for extensions. You want to be careful about that. You don't want to get yourself running into the next term with too many extensions. You may have to reduce your course load in the end. But ask for those extensions. I've been teaching courses all the way through this, and people have come asking for extensions. I've been, along with my colleagues, been giving those out without any qualms. 30 days is quite reasonable to ask for it.
Okay. Well, on that note, it's 3 o'clock. I want to thank you both for sharing your insights and answering all the questions. We didn't get to all of them. I just want to mention that this idea came through Jamie Gelfand, who along with Katie McCunn, created the ADHD links 20 years ago. And it was because they realized there were limited resources at that time in Calgary to support families, and especially girls with ADHD. And they've since gone on to become a very important resource for navigating the ADHD landscapes for families in Calgary. And I know Jamie was online with us today, so very valuable resource, and her contact info will also be shared at the end of the session. Before we go, I'd like to remind our community that mental health supports continue to be available. For all Calgarians looking for mental health support and resources, please reach out to 211 via phone or text. And we hope that you found this webinar useful, and we look forward to we look forward to seeing you again on one of our future webinars. Thanks very much, and you will have the list of resources at the end of this session. Take care, stay safe, and thanks again to Michael and to Karen.